The wine hit the gravel between Roy Calloway's boots, and for one long second nobody in the courtyard made a sound. A whole glass of it, deep red, almost black in the afternoon light, thrown straight down at the feet of the old man holding a crate of empty bottles. It splashed across his worn leather boots and the cuffs of his jeans, and it just sat there in the white gravel like something bleeding out. That,
you think you can
said
just
the
show
man
up here
who
and
drove
ruin
it,
everything?
Is why I'm getting rid of
After
every
all this
single one
time,
of
get
you.
out!
His name was Spencer Vaughn. He was 37 years old, and 4 months ago, he had paid $61 million for this hillside. Now he stood at the head of a long stone table with 40 of the most important people in American wine watching him, and he had just made a show of tasting his own estate's flagship bottle, curling his lip like he'd bitten into something spoiled and emptying the glass at the nearest worker he could find. The nearest worker was Roy. Roy didn't flinch. He set the crate down on the stone wall, slow and easy, the way a man moves when he's spent 40 years around things that can break. Then he crouched down and started picking the bigger pieces of glass out of the gravel with his bare fingers. His hands were dark and scarred and steady. One of them stopped for just a half a second over a curved shard with the stem still attached, and something moved across his face and was gone before anyone could catch it. "Mind your shoes, sir," Roy said quietly, not looking up. "Glass everywhere now." Spencer laughed, and because he laughed, a few of the guests laughed too, the way people always laugh with the man who signs the checks. "It talks," Spencer said. "Hey, old-timer, do you even know what you just made me drink, or do you people just bottle whatever leaks out of the barn and slap a fancy label on it?" Roy stood up. He was 58. Lean as a fence wire, white stubble on his jaw, eyes the gray of river rock. He held the broken glass in one open palm and looked at the younger man for what felt, to the people watching, like a very long time. "Tasted fine to me," he said. Then he turned and carried the crate toward the back of the cellar, and not one person in that courtyard knew they had just watched a billionaire spit on the man who built every dollar that hillside was worth. Now, before I tell you the rest, and I promise you, you want the rest, let me say one thing. Somewhere out there right now, somebody is being measured by the worst stretch of their life instead of the best work of their hands. Maybe that's you. Maybe somebody looked at you once, decided who you were, and never bothered to check again. If you've ever been written off and counted out and chose to just keep your head down and keep working anyway, do me a favor and type 2 words down below, "Still here," because this story is for you. And because what happens to Spencer Vaughn over the next 20 minutes is the reason I had to tell it. All right, back to Roy Calloway. 20 years ago, this valley said his name the way people say the names of weather and saints. He'd come up out of nothing. Born in a dry little town in the Texas Hill Country, he'd by his grandfather after his folks took off, and the old man kept a copper still out behind the feed barn and made peach brandy that the whole county pretended not to buy. That's where Roy learned his nose, not in any school. Standing on an apple crate at 6 years old, watching his grandfather hold a spoonful up to the light and say, "This batch ran too hot. Boy, you can smell the burn in it." Roy could smell the burn in it. He could always smell everything. He came west at 20 with $300 and a duffel bag, and he took a job washing tanks at a winery in Sonoma County, and within 10 years there wasn't a cellar in California that didn't know his name. He had a gift that people drove for hours just to test because they couldn't believe it was real. You could pour him a glass blind, no label, no hint, and he'd swirl it once, breathe it in, take one sip, and tell you the hillside it grew on, the year, the slope it faced. Sometimes, if he was feeling mean, the name of the fool who'd made it. But the gift wasn't the thing that made him a legend. The thing that made him a legend was a patch of failing dirt above the town of Glen Ellen, a steep, stony hillside everybody said was worthless, that Roy bought with a loan he had no business getting and planted with his own 2 hands. He talked to those vines. He walked the rows at 4 in the morning, all through harvest, tasting single grapes off single canes, learning every block of that hill the way a father learns the moods of his own child. He called the label Ironheart. And Ironheart became the most famous American wine of its generation. A single bottle of the '06 sold at auction in Geneva for $11,000. Sommeliers in Tokyo kept the empty bottles on a shelf behind glass, lit up like holy relics. Roy Calloway, the kid from a feed barn in Texas, had made something the whole world wanted. He did it all without ever raising his voice. He married a woman named Marin who ran the books and the tasting room and laughed at his superstitions, and they had a daughter, Hannah, who grew up barefoot between those rows. For a while there, it was the kind of life you don't believe people actually get to have. And then it came apart, all at once, and from the side he wasn't watching. It was the middle of harvest, the busiest week of the year, and Roy was up on the crush pad at dawn when the right side of his body simply stopped listening to him. The glass slid out of his hand, his leg folded. He went down between the tanks and couldn't get a word out of his own mouth, and the last thing he remembered before the dark was the sound of his own voice trying to say a name and not making it. A stroke, a bad one. He was 56. He spent the next 11 months learning to walk again, learning to hold a spoon, learning, God help him, to say his own daughter's name without it coming out crooked. And while he was in that hospital and then that little rehab center, fighting to get his own hand to close around a fork, the world outside decided he was finished. Here's the part that still puts a knot in my chest. He couldn't speak for himself, literally could not, and his silence got filled up by everybody else. A rival winery 2 ridges over, owned by a man who'd lost to Ironheart at every competition for 15 years, started whispering that Roy had lost it, that the stroke took his palate, that whatever made Calloway special was gone, burned out, dead, and there was nobody to say otherwise, because Roy was in a fluorescent room trying to remember how to button a shirt, and Marin had been diagnosed with cancer the same spring and was fading fast in a room down the hall. By the time Roy could speak again, his wife was gone. The harvest he'd missed had been a disaster under the panicked crew, and the bank had already decided. They forced the sale. The buyers kept the name Ironheart because the name was the only thing on that hill worth anything, and they cut loose the man who'd made it. There was a clause in the papers about reputational risk. Roy didn't read it close. He signed it in the rehab parking lot with his left hand because the right one still didn't work right, and Marin's wedding ring was in his coat pocket. He never once explained himself, never told a soul about the stroke. People took the silence for shame and decided the whispers must have been true. So for 12 years, Roy Calloway disappeared into the work, pruning crews in the cold months, picking crews in the fall. He moved between estates that never once recognized the dirt under his fingernails as the same dirt that used to be worth $11,000 a bottle. He rented a room above a hardware store in Healdsburg, and he sent every dollar he could spare to Hannah, who'd been 11 when her mother died and her father broke, and who was 23 now, and who had just done the one thing he'd begged her not to do. She'd quit her good job down in the city and come home for the harvest. He found her that first morning out in the rows before the sun was all the way up, holding 2 paper cups of coffee, watching him do the thing he could not stop doing. He'd pull a single grape, press it between his thumb and finger, touch it to the tip of his tongue, and go still. The whole machinery of his face working out the sugar and the acid, and the exact number of days that hill had left until it was ready. He did it without thinking. He'd done it 100,000 times. The stroke had taken a lot from him. It never touched that. "You're gonna get yourself fired," Hannah said, handing him a cup. "They don't pay you to taste. They pay you to pick." Old habit. Dad. She looked up the slope at the rows, climbing it in their straight green lines, and at the big stone house at the top, where the new owner threw his parties. "This is Ironheart. This is your hill. How do you come back here and just pick?" Roy looked at the grape in his palm. "Hill doesn't know it changed hands," he said. "Vines can't read paperwork. They still do exactly what I taught them. That's enough for me." It wasn't enough, and she knew it, and she let it go. That was a kind of quiet she'd learned from him. The man who owned the hill now, Spencer Vaughn, had made his money fast and young, building software that helped other software talk to itself, and he'd sold it for a number with a lot of zeros before he turned 35. He bought the estate the way a man buys a watch he can't actually read, for the name on the face. He kept the Ironheart label. He put his own name up over the front gate in iron letters 3 feet tall. He fired the cellar master who'd hung on for a decade and brought in a consultant who'd never grown anything in his life. And he told a magazine he was going to disrupt the category and build a heritage brand for the modern consumer. He had exactly one problem. The wine had gotten worse every single year since Roy left, and Spencer couldn't taste it. And the only people on that property who could were too scared of him to open their mouths. The most scared of all was a man named Frank Dalton. Frank was 60. He'd been the vineyard manager at Ironheart for 22 years, before Roy, alongside Roy, and now under Spencer. He'd watched Roy build the whole thing out of a worthless hillside, and he'd watched the bank throw Roy out the door, and he'd said nothing then because he had a mortgage and a wife with a bad hip and nowhere else in the world to go. When Roy turned up on the picking crew that spring, Frank knew him in half a second, and he said nothing again. He just quietly made sure Roy got the shaded rows in the afternoon heat and the easy work, and he carried the not saying anything around in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed and never managed to bring back up. "You shouldn't be here," Frank told him once, low behind the equipment shed. "Somebody's gonna recognize you. This isn't right. You out here hauling bins on your own land." "Nobody looks at the man holding the crate," Frank Roy said, and he was right about that. The party at the end of that week was the biggest the estate had ever thrown. Spencer had spent the whole summer chasing the one person on earth whose word could turn his expensive name into a respected one. And he had finally somehow gotten her to say yes. He told everybody she was coming. He told them 3 separate times. Her name was Eleanor Frost. She was the most powerful wine critic alive, and it wasn't close. A high score from Eleanor Frost could double the price of a bottle overnight. A single cold sentence from her had ended estates that had stood for 100 years. She was 70, small, gray, dressed in plain dark clothes, and she did not smile. She had turned Spencer down twice before she said yes, and she never did tell him why she finally agreed to come. He was too thrilled to ask. She arrived in a plain car and a plain coat, and she walked the whole property in silence, with her hands clasped behind her back while Spencer talked and talked. She didn't write a thing down. She looked at the vines, and once, just once, for a long moment, she stopped and looked at the old field hand crouched at the end of the 11th row before she turned away. The tasting was the centerpiece of the whole afternoon. Spencer had set it up like a performance. The long stone table, 40 guests, the new vintage poured into crystal glasses that cost more than a picker made in a day. He stood at the head of it next to Eleanor Frost, and he made a whole show out of it, swirling and sniffing and holding court like a man who'd watched other people do it in movies. And it was right there, after his second glass, that the wine offended him in some way he couldn't have put into words if his life depended on it. And he did the thing with the glass. And he picked the nearest worker to humiliate in front of his important guests. And the nearest worker was Roy. And the courtyard went dead silent, exactly the way I told you it did at the start. Roy turned and carried his crate toward the cellar. He almost made it to the door. "Wait." It was Hannah's voice. She'd been moving along the far wall, carrying trays of water glasses, invisible the way the help is always invisible at a party like that. Now she set her tray down on a side table, the glasses clicking together, and she walked straight into the middle of the courtyard. 40 pairs of expensive eyes turned to watch a picker's daughter in a stained work apron do something not one of them would have had the nerve to do. "Sir." She was looking right at Spencer, and her voice was calm in a way that made people lean in. "You asked if he even knows what wine is supposed to taste like, so why don't you let him answer? Make him taste it, right here in front of everybody." A pause. "I think they'd all like to hear the truth about what's in their glass." Spencer's grin came back wide. This was even better than the throw. "You want me to let the hired help play sommelier?" He turned to his guests, arms spread, a man who had never once in his life misjudged a room until this exact afternoon. "Fine, this'll be educational. Come here, old-timer. Taste it. Tell us all what you taste. And when you can't," the smile sharpened, "you and your girl collect your pay and you're off my property tonight." Roy stood by the cellar door with the low gold light behind him. Hannah met his eyes across the courtyard. She didn't say anything. She just lifted her chin a half an inch, the smallest motion, the exact way her mother used to. And Roy set down the crate and came back. He took the glass out of Spencer's hand. He didn't swirl it for the crowd. He held it up to the light for a moment, the same way he'd held that broken stem, and his face did the thing it couldn't stop doing. He drank. And the silence in that courtyard changed temperature. When he started to speak, his voice was different. The people who'd heard him mumble "mind your shoes" 10 minutes ago didn't recognize it. It had rhythm now. It had certainty. It was the voice of a man stepping back up onto a stage he'd been kept off of for 12 years, and you could feel something in him that everybody had assumed was dead just. Light back up. 2022, he said. Block C, the lower terrace, the part that faces east, down where the morning fog sits longest. He turned the glass, slow. You picked it 4 days too late. You can taste the heat in it. The sugar ran out, way ahead of everything else, so it's all weight and no spine. And whoever's running your cellars got scared when the numbers came in wrong and dropped the fermentation temperature too fast, trying to save it. So now it's hollow. There's nothing in the middle of it. The fruit got chased off the vine before it was ready, and you can taste the fear in it as clear as you can taste the oak. He set the glass down on the stone without a sound. It's not a bad wine, he said. It's a frightened one. Somebody made it in a hurry, with a man standing over their shoulder who they were afraid of. That's the loudest thing in the glass. He looked up, and his gray eyes went right to Spencer. You can always taste fear. It's the one thing you can never hide in a bottle. For 3 full seconds, not one person breathed. And then Eleanor Frost stood up. She set her own glass down very carefully, like it had suddenly gotten heavy. She walked the whole length of that long table, past the guests, past Spencer Vaughn, who had started to smile the uncertain smile of a man who feels the floor moving under him but can't find the crack. And she stopped in front of the old field hand in the wine-stained jeans. And the most powerful wine critic alive bowed her head to him. "Mr. Calloway," she said, and every single person there heard her voice shake. "I'd heard you left the trade for good, years ago." She lifted her head. "I came up here today because somebody told me there was an old picker at Ironheart who tastes single grapes off the vine at 4 in the morning. And I didn't believe it. I didn't believe you were still alive, frankly." She turned and faced the table, and her voice went hard and carried to every corner of that courtyard. "Most of you are too young or too comfortable to understand what you're standing in the middle of. This man built this. He took a hillside, 3 different surveyors called Worthless, and he planted it on his hands and knees, and he made the most important American wine of the last 40 years out of it. The '06 Ironheart that a few of you keep on a shelf and are too frightened to open. He made that. With these hands." She didn't even glance at Spencer. The name over that gate. The name this gentleman paid $61 million for. It is this man's whole life. They kept his name and they threw the man himself out into the field, and then they let the world believe he'd lost his gift, when the truth is he'd had a stroke and was learning to walk again while his wife died down the hall. A sound went through the crowd. Roy's head came up sharp. He hadn't known anyone knew that. Eleanor Frost met his eyes and gave him the smallest nod. "I do my research," that nod said. "I have tasted 40,000 wines in my life," she went on. "I have met 3 people who could do what this man just did. Taste a glass and tell you the slope it grew on and the fear in the room where it was made." She paused. 2 of them are dead. He's the last one." Spencer Vaughn wasn't smiling anymore. He was looking at the old man he'd thrown a glass at. He was looking at the broken crystals still scattered in the gravel, the piece Roy's hand had paused over, and you could watch it land on him, slow and terrible, that Roy had recognized that glass, because Roy had chosen it 20 years ago, picked that exact crystal for this exact room. He looked at his important guests, and not one of them would meet his eyes. He had spent $61 million to buy a legend, and he had just found out, in front of every person whose opinion he'd been chasing all summer, that he had never for 1 second owned the only thing that made it a legend. "I didn't," Spencer started. "No," Eleanor Frost said. "You didn't. And it should have ended there. The rich man humbled, the old man vindicated. Everybody goes home. But the truest moment of the whole afternoon happened off to the side, where almost nobody was looking. Frank Dalton had been standing frozen by the cellar door the entire time, and now he came forward into the light, and his face was the color of ash, and his hands were shaking. "He's right," Frank said. His voice cracked clean in half. Everybody turned. About all of it. Block C, the 4 days, the temperature. That was me. I'm the one who panicked. I dropped the ferment because the numbers scared me, and there was nobody left who knew better. He looked at Roy, and 12 years of swallowed stone came up all at once. "And I've known who you were since the morning you walked back onto this property last spring. I gave you the shade rose. I kept my mouth shut, and I let you haul bins on your own dirt for 6 months because I was scared. Scared of him. Scared of losing the only job I've got left." His eyes were running over now, and he wasn't bothering to stop it. "I watched them write your name off this valley, and I never said one word. I'm sorry, Roy. God is my witness. I'm so sorry. And this was the part the rich guests didn't understand, and the part you and I understand just fine. The villain was never really the man who threw the glass. Spencer was just careless and small. The thing that cost Roy Calloway 12 years was the silence of decent people who knew better and were too afraid to say so. Frank's confession was the only apology in that whole courtyard that actually cost the man making it something. Roy looked at Frank for a long moment, and then he did the thing nobody expected, because they were all still waiting on the speech. The triumph, the knife going in. He didn't give it to them. He walked past Eleanor Frost, past the gaping guests, past Spencer Vaughn standing there with his ruined afternoon, and he went down the worn steps into the cellar. He came back up a minute later with a bottle so covered in dust you could barely read it. The 06, the last one. He'd hidden it behind a loose brick in the back wall the week before they forced him out. 12 years ago, because he couldn't stand to let the bank auction off the very last bottle of the best thing he ever made. He found a clean glass. He poured 2 fingers of it, wine the color of garnet and old blood and a fire about to go out, and he put the glass into Frank Dalton's shaking hands. "You stayed when I couldn't," Roy said, low, just for him. "You kept these vines alive 12 years so there'd be something here for me to come home to, even if you couldn't say it out loud. That's worth more than any apology." He closed Frank's trembling fingers around the glass. "Drink it. You earned a taste of it more than anybody standing in this courtyard." Then he found his daughter at the edge of the crowd, and he put his hand on the back of her neck, and the two of them walked out through the big iron gate. Under Spencer Vaughn's 3-foot iron, letters, and down between the rows of the hill that never once knew it had changed hands. Now, here's what happened to Spencer Vaughn. Because I know that's what you're sitting there waiting for, and you've more than earned it. Eleanor Frost was already on her phone before Roy reached the gate. Her column came out 6 days later. It is the single most famous thing she ever wrote, and people in that business still talk about it. She did not attack the wine. She did something far worse. She told the whole story, the hillside, the stroke, the dying wife, the whispers, the man hauling bins on his own land for 12 years while a billionaire spat at his feet. She titled it, "The Man They Erased," and in the last line she wrote, "Vaughn Estate produces a competent, frightened wine and will continue to because its owner purchased a soul he was never able to recognize," and then poured it out onto the gravel. I will not be scoring it. There is nothing there to score. I will not be scoring it. From Eleanor Frost, that was a death sentence. The distributors who'd flown in for that party started backing out within the week. The luxury hotel group that had been about to sign a huge account went quiet and then went away. The number Spencer had paid, $61 million for the name, turned into a number he could not get a buyer within $20 million of because the entire wine world now knew the truth. That he had bought the bottle and thrown away the vineyard. His heritage brand for the modern consumer became a punchline. Within 18 months, Spencer Vaughn quietly sold what was left of the estate at a staggering loss to people who never put his name on anything again. But money was never the part that got him. I want to be honest with you about that, because it's the part that matters. What got him was a thing that happened almost a year after the party. Spencer drove out one gray morning to a small leased parcel of old vines up above Healdsburg, 12 acres nobody had wanted, that Roy and Hannah Calloway were quietly bringing back to life with a loan and a handshake and the backing of an old gray woman who believed in second acts. Spencer parked his expensive car at the bottom of the dirt lane, and he walked up, and he stood there in his nice shoes in the mud, and he waited for Roy to come down out of the rows. "I'm not here about the money," Spencer said. His voice didn't sound like the man from the courtyard at all. It sounded like a person who hadn't been sleeping. "I lost the money, that's fine. I had it coming. I'm here because I can't." He stopped, started over. "I tasted everything wrong, my whole life. I thought you bought the name and the name was the thing. I thought the people doing the work were the cost, and the label was the value, and I had it exactly backwards. I had it backwards about everything." He looked up the hill at the young vines coming back. "I spent $60 million, and I never once asked who made it. I threw a glass at the only person who could have taught me. I think about that every single day." Roy stood there with the morning sun behind him and looked at the younger man in his ruined shoes for a long moment. "I know you do," he said. "Not cruel, just true. That's the price, not the money." He nodded down the lane at the car. "The money you'll make back, men like you always do. What you'll carry is knowing you held the best thing in your hand, and you poured it on the ground because you couldn't see it." He paused. "That's a long thing to carry. I'm not gonna make it heavier. But I'm not gonna take it off you either. That part's yours." Spencer Vaughn nodded. He didn't argue. He stood there a second longer, then he turned and walked back down the dirt lane to his car, and he drove away. And the story is that he never bought another vineyard as long as he lived. Some people who knew him later said it was the only time in his life he ever truly learned something. It cost him $61 million, and the only afternoon that ever mattered, and he learned it. Roy watched the car go until the dust settled. Then he turned and walked back up into the rows. Hannah was up there waiting, sleeves pushed up, dirt to her elbows, working a young vine onto the wire. She'd heard most of it. She watched her father come up the slope, and when he reached her, she crossed her arms and worked something out before she said it. "You could have ruined him," she said. "Right there at the party, with Frost standing next to you. You could have taken all of it back in one sentence and let her burn him to the ground. Why didn't you?" Roy reached out without breaking stride and pulled a single grape off the nearest cane. He pressed it between his thumb and his finger, the old motion, the one the stroke never managed to take, and he held it out to her. "Taste." She did, and it was perfect, dark and sweet and exactly ready. The sugar and the acid sitting in a balance you can't fake and you can't rush, no matter how much money you've got. "That dirt down there was here before Vaughn," Roy said, looking out over the young hill the two of them were bringing back from the dead. "It'll be here a long time after him." And it never once got angry at the people who didn't understand it. It doesn't waste a single day being angry. He turned the empty stem in his fingers. It just waits for its season, keeps its head down, keeps doing the work nobody's watching, and then, when the season finally comes around, it gives everything it's got, all at once, to whoever was still there, whoever stayed. He looked at his daughter. "We stayed," he said. And then he went back to the vines, and after a moment, Hannah went with him, the two of them moving down the rows in the early light, and the hill folded them out of sight. And somewhere down in that valley a glass was being poured for somebody who'd waited a very long time to be tasted. This is a work of fiction. All names, characters, businesses, and events are products of the imagination, and any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or to actual wineries or brands is entirely coincidental.